Come to the show. We about to chop it up. Come to the show. We got some things we can talk about. Come to the show. We about to chop it up. Come to the show. We got some things we can talk about. Chop it up. Chop it, chop it, chop it, chop it up. Chop. We got some things we can talk about. Chop it up. Chop it, chop it, chop it up. Chop it, chop it. Come to the show. We about to chop it up. Come to the show. We got some things we can talk about. Come to the show. We about to chop it up. Come to the show. We got some things we can talk about. Chop it up. Chop it, chop it, chop it up. Chop. We got some things we can talk about. Chop it up. Chop it, chop it, chop it up. Chop it up. Chop. We got some things we can talk about. Come to the show. We about to chop it up. Come to the show. We got some things we can talk about. Come to the show. We about to chop it up. Come to the show. We got some things we can talk about. Chop it up. Chop it, chop it, chop it up. Chop. We got some things we can talk about. Chop it up. Chop it, chop it, chop it up. Chop it up. Chop. We got some things we can talk about. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Chop Shop. I am your host, Pastor Marvin McKenstry Jr., and as always, I got rocking with me, my right hand and my left hand. He's my main man, Shaka Pitts. First and foremost, we give honor and glory to God for another opportunity to bring you the real, relevant voices on the topics that matter most in Baltimore. I got my beautiful co-host, Miss Bay, right here beside me, is always holding me down, and we have a great show lined up for you tonight. We are going to talk about that topic that you hear all over the place: defund the police. Well, we got some people to tell you what that really means and what that really looks like. But before we do that, we want to jump into the news. As of Friday at 5 p.m., Baltimore entered phase 2 of its recovery program, or its reopening process. In a statement, Mayor Jack Young said, "While we continue to work to combat the spread of COVID-19, I'm pleased to announce Baltimore City will be shifting into its second phase of reopening businesses and services." Mayor Young said, "I have been carefully weighing a combination of factors, including our health related data, and economic impacts of continued closure, and I have made the decision to expand reopenings effective 5 p.m. and that was on Friday. My immediate post on Facebook and Twitter was use wisdom, because we know that we're gonna keep it a stack. The reality is this reopening process and plan, if you're listening to it, it's always focused around businesses because economics is priority one. What do you think, Shop?
You preaching to the choir right now, good brother. I'm with you 1,000,000,000% on that. I feel like for me, again, I'm paying attention to what the medical population is saying, because a lot of this stuff is financially driven, and I'm not trying to be a number because of numbers, if that makes sense.
Right. And as a pastor and a church leader myself, man, one who has to make decisions that impact a lot of people, I'm riding right with you, Shop. We in no rush to go back, not if it's going to compromise anybody's health. So again, everybody continue to use wisdom in this process of returning, reopening. If you're a business owner, whatever the case may be, you got employees, be really considerate that lives are always above economics. And when they're not, you got a bigger issue. So Rayshard Brooks, man, he was laid to rest today in Atlanta in the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was the pastor for many years. Man, we want to send our love and send our prayers and all of our compassion to Rayshard Brooks and his family through this very trying time, which is impacting our entire nation, man. But sometimes I think in the wake of protests and all of the mainstream attention, we forget that there's a family that loves
a whole family that's going through something right now.
Absolutely, including kids, man. He was remembered as a fun-loving dad, man. And this statement right here I wanted to share. They said that he was a fun-loving dad that was taken away by a racist legal system of imprisonment, probation, and police violence. Man, I echo the sentiment greatly, because I'm just tired of seeing a different outcome for Black men who have the most minuscule of violations than mass killers who are white men.
It was funny. I had a conversation right before the show with a buddy of mine. He said he has a white friend who he personally knows has done some outrageous things to cops, even as far as flipping cops off and driving in front of them and just all types of stuff, right? That he said, as a Black man, he know for a fact there's no way, that he would be able to get away with certain things. And it's clear, man. Like, so I'm with you. Like, I'm tired of the two sides of the coin. Nah, same coin. Like let's call it for what it is every single time. Other than that, like, y'all playing with us, man. Y'all playing with us. And I'm tired of being played with.
Tonight, I'm sorry for cutting you off.
No, go ahead, brother.
That's why this conversation is so important tonight. But I read a very, very, very interesting article. I'm not going to give a lot of detail on it because I'm hoping that maybe we are worthy enough to maybe get the spinoff of this conversation. But Dan Rodricks went one-on-one with the Democratic mayoral nominee, Brandon Scott. Everybody kind of looks at it as though his work is done, but he does still have an election to win in November. And they asked him pertinent questions on a lot of the issues that are in the news now, like defunding police. Again, I ain't gonna tell you what he said because I'm hoping we can get him on the chop shop. But go to the Sun, Baltimore Sun, or sunspot.net. Look at it and read the article. It's a really, really interesting piece. And finally, in our feel good news segment today, again, y'all know I'm personally connected and I love this group. The men of We Are Us on this past weekend did it big. The rain couldn't stop it over at Dunbar Field. They started off with a car caravan that had one of the longest processions that I've ever seen in my life. And I went live one time during the caravan just to say, boy, we got a mega procession out here and nobody's dead. We got a super procession out here and it ain't being led by no hearse. But those men, in classic fashion as they do, the heavens opened up on us, the rain came down, and we still right there in the midst of it, focused our energy, and we wind up taking the food to the people because the people couldn't come to us at Dunbar Field. So we went over into Latrobe and we unloaded trucks. You see the pictures. We went over in Latrobe, unloaded trucks. We went to 4th Street Apartments, man. We took it to the people, and the people was so blessed by it. Man, I'm just honored to be a part of this move. We have really been addressing food insecurity. I had a double blessing that day as my dad was out with me, man, and we were able to just be honest about our testimony that we have had some healing take place over the last few years, but to be out there with my main guy, you know what I mean? Him sharing in my passion to serve was everything to me. All right, Shock. So we get ready to move to our Black business focus. Our Black business focus today is a young woman that I don't know when I didn't know her. We grew up literally in the same neighborhood down in the Lexington Terrace projects. And by the grace of God, we not only survived the growing up, but we both have been able to come to a place where we're very productive people. I want to invite to the Chop Shop my very, very good friend, Miss Sean Wheeler. And she has a business called Earrings by Sean. She hand makes these and handcrafts these beautiful earrings that she makes. It's always important to us. Juneteenth is every day in my life, and it's every show here on the Chop Shop. And we want to always make sure that we highlight Black businesses on our Black Business Spotlight. Sean, how you feeling tonight?
I am wonderful. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate you as always. I always tell you I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
I also have the pleasure and honor, privilege of being a mentor to Sean's son, who's a wonderful young man. Sean, tell us how you wind up. What brought about Earrings by Sean?
Well, what brought about Earrings by Sean was I started off as a paparazzi accessory consultant. And I started selling merchandise for paparazzi. And one day I just woke up and I said, Sean, why are you making someone else rich? Why are you not making yourself rich? Right? Or why are you not making yourself a household name? So that's what sparked me to start Earrings by Sean. My sister, Anya Beverly, she made a couple of samples for me. And then I was like, I need more. And Sean will make my own, but I started selling accessories and jewelry by selling paparazzi. And like I said, I wanted to do something for myself.
We ain't calling their name no more. We got one of your wonderful handcrafted items up on the screen. Talk to us about the earrings themselves, whatever it is that whatever else you may be selling, the handcrafted quality. I want the people to hear that from you.
Well, all of my earrings are made from recycled materials, right? Whether if it's old jeans that I can't fit anymore, if it's old jeans that my son can't fit, people have donated clothes to me. So every single material that you actually see, I use materials that are recycled. I use old pocketbooks. I use luxury pocketbooks. I'm a big thrifter. So I even go out and I go thrifting for certain things. The earrings, number one, are affordable. They're handmade by me. Earrings by Sean. They're chic, they're sexy, they're classy, and they're edgy. They're everything that I think that I am. And those are all the things that I think that I am: sexy, edgy, classy. And like I said, they are affordable and they're handmade by me. I also sell graphic tees, which are really fly. So I'm just getting into that. So like I said, I have graphic tees for ladies. I have graphic tees for men. So just look at my Facebook and my Instagram, and you can see all the things that I have to offer. Most of the items start from $10 up to $35. So I try to keep things affordable. so that everybody can purchase my items. But I'm happy. I'm glad that I started this business, and I'm just all in it.
So for my last question, I want you to do me a favor. You got young Black entrepreneurs, but you got young Black women. You're a proud single mother out there that have a vision or a dream. I want you in your own words to talk to them real quick about where you would give them a word of encouragement from Sean about following their vision and chasing their dream.
I always say that everybody has a hustle, right? Everybody has a hustle. Just make it a legal hustle, right? Make it a legal hustle. Do something that you love and turn it into a business, right? It can be anything as long as it's legal, right? Turn your hustle into something that's legal and thrive off of that. And just, put your mind to it. I'm here to help anybody who needs help, to try to point people in the right direction of what to do. But just hustle and hustle hard.
That's dope. Thank you for coming on tonight.
Thank you.
Tell people real quick one time where they can find you on Instagram.
You can find me on Instagram at Earrings by Sean. Those who don't have Instagram, you can find me on Facebook at Sean's Earrings. I post daily, so check me out. Shipping is not that expensive. I try to work with people. I have Cash App. I take all forms of payment except checks. But
people write checks at the bank.
It's all good. Just follow me. I'm here. Thank you again, Marvin. I appreciate you. Thank you, Bay. I see you in the background. I love you.
I love you too, and thank you so much for coming on tonight. The viewership is already real high. My sister Nika, she's on tonight. She said, do it for the culture. And she said, have a moral hustle. That's right.
Yes.
Chop Shop audience tonight. If you go to the LBS Baltimore page where where the broadcast tonight is originating from via StreamYard, you'll be able to post your comments and we'll be able to get them up on the screen for everybody to see what you're saying during the broadcast. We're about to jump right into our topic. But before we do, we always do a dedication to a strong Black champion in Baltimore. And tonight, although we're talking about defunding police, I thought it appropriate to bring up one of my favorite guys, a guy who wore that uniform for 39 years. And he showed us and literally established a lot of the foundational work that is the bridge between Baltimore's police and its citizens. We got that picture ready, shot. That's right. Y'all see him. Retired Colonel Marvin Russell. A man who Baltimore knows and still loves. I just found out when I spoke to him earlier today that he is actually celebrating his 60th birthday today. So even though it's important that we have these conversations, I wanted in this moment in Spotlight, where we normally lift up a Black champion for Baltimore, to lift up this great man who's a man of God and who was a man on the ground, making sure that his ministry was bridging the gap between Baltimore's police and its citizens. And now it's time, y'all. It's time to get right into this topic. I've said all that I'm going to say about anything other than defunding the police. And tonight, I have some amazing guests who are experts in everything from policy and legislation all the way to police advocacy, accountability, you name it. These are the guys that know this work. So tonight, I'm getting ready to bring them on the screen. One of my favorite brothers. I call him a little brother because I'm a little older, but he's a real giant as it pertains to this work of policy and advocacy and you name it. I'm going to let him tell you a lot more about it. I don't want to go into the deeper depths. He's a regular contributor to the Chop Shop, and I want to thank him as he comes onto the screen. Y'all show some hearts and some likes for my man, Dayvon Love. Come on, bro.
Hey, appreciate the invite as always. you definitely a big brother to me, and so appreciate just all of what you do to help our community.
I appreciate you coming on tonight to talk about this very important topic. Next, I got my big brother, one who has brought me along in the ways of understanding what it is to do real work in the community. You know, one thing that I'm going to be transparent and honest about, you can go through spaces in Baltimore where you really feel like you're doing some work, only to run into some people that make you check yourself. They make you really check what impact you having, that you might have some people who like what you're doing and calling your name, but at the same time, are you reaching the people? This is a man who has made his life, his second chance in life, one, to deal with holding police accountable and reach it, making sure that everything that comes out of his work reaches the very community that he loves. Give it up for my man, old West Baltimore, Ray Kelly.
What's up, bro, brother?
What's up, big bro?
Appreciate y'all for having me on.
I appreciate for having you, man. We're going to get right into this conversation. But I got one more guest that I need to bring on, and he's somebody that I'm being introduced to right now at this time. But I'm appreciative that somebody in his position would be willing to come on to have this very much needed, conversation. You know, our goal here at the Chop Shop is to bring the relevant, tangible voices to topics that are affecting Baltimore, my home, my love. I might talk about Atlanta because I got compassion for Rayshard, but my love and my home in this show is about Baltimore. We have my man, Delegate Gabriel Acevero, and I hope that I pronounced that right. If I didn't, feel free to correct me, but I'm excited to have you on and been looking forward to you being with us today.
You got it right. Appreciate it. Good to be in conversation with you all. And I want to shout out to Dayvon for extending the invitation and just allowing me to be a part of this discussion tonight. So thanks.
So I want y'all to know right up front, I got my ginger tea, and my goal is to sit back, sip my ginger tea, and take some notes myself, as these men are the experts. These are the ones. So there's been a prevailing question, right? For many people, some people are headline chasers, right? They see the headline, they jump right onto it, and they try to speak on it like they know. But if you're a follower of mine on social media, you have not seen one post trying to act like I know a whole bunch about defunding the police. And the reality of it is I've done some research to learn some things, but I've been excited tonight to hear from these men who understand that. So I'm coming to get educated. Dayvon, defunding the police, what is that really, and what does it look like?
So just a couple of things about that I think to get us started. The first is, it's not common knowledge, and it hasn't been common knowledge till very recently, that police budgets around the country are enormous. In Baltimore, I'm sure as many of your viewers know, our budget in Baltimore City, a third of it is the police, right? And so you're talking about, we broke $500 million for the second or third year in a row. So when we match how much money is spent on public safety with the quality of the service we get, I think most people come to the conclusion that those services have been not only insufficient, right, but law enforcement has actually played a role in many cases in causing more harm to our community, right? So a part of what the fundamental logic is supposed to be about defund police is, if we paying all this money, right, and it's not being effective, and in fact it's funding a police institution that's doing harm to our community, then the reaction is, well, we need to take some of those resources away, right? So that's one piece. The other piece around defunding police I think is really important is that many of us have not been able to imagine a world without police, right? And in the current world that we live in, right, police function for many people as a necessary part of the ecosystem of things that's necessary to have a healthy community, a healthy community and neighborhood. So a part of what this is about is also reimagining, like, what would it look like to really do public safety where police were not central to it. And an example of this is that when you think about, so it's common knowledge now that Martin O'Malley put forward a zero tolerance policy when he was mayor of Baltimore City. Between 1999 and 2006, the independent human rights investigation showed that there were 757,000 illegal arrests made in Baltimore City over that period of time,
Say that number again, Dayvon, because I don't want people to think you said 7,500 or 75,000. Say that number again for me.
So 757,000 illegal arrests between the time of 1999 and 2006. And in fact, I believe it was 2006 where there were 100,000 illegal arrests in that 1 year. The local branch of the NAACP, the ACLU, along with then Delegate Carter, were participants in suing the Baltimore City Police Department for that and won settlements for those who were plaintiffs on the case. So what I'm saying isn't like conspiracy theory. Like, this is stuff that has been established, by mainstream documentation. And so when you think about what Martin O'Malley did in 1999, there was a big problem in terms of public safety. And what he did was he campaigned on, I'm going to have more police, and he campaigned on tough on crime. And part of the problem is that when you talk to people who live in neighborhoods where there's just lots of violence in the neighborhood, and you give people only two options, more police or less police, they're going to pick more police, right? And that's part of the limitations of how like policy's been made, is that people haven't been given the space. And one of the questions I ask sometimes in a room full of people who are like your traditional neighborhood association folks is, if I were to say that I can get together a group of 50 brothers, they would make sure that no one was going to break into your house. They would make sure nobody's hustling on your corner. You know what I'm saying? If I were to guarantee that, would you be satisfied with that? And most people raise their hand, right, and say, yeah, I would be fine with that. So to me, that's just like a small example of what is it going to take for us to reimagine what public safety looks like. But we have to build the alternative institutions. We have to build the capacity for the community to police itself, right? As we think about what defund means. And that's been part of my concern. My concern has been, to your earlier point, that the focus is on, let's just take the money away from the police department, let's just defund police. Without thinking about some of the people who have legitimate concerns about public safety. Like, how do you make sure that, the grandmother that lives in McAdderley Park actually feels safe? So both of those things are important. And I think that's got to be an essential part of the conversation about defunding police.
So Ray, I'm going to come to you third. I want to really jump to Delegate Acevero. And I want to pose the exact same question to you. And the reason I'm coming to Ray third is because I'm going to frame this question out a little differently to my big bro. But I want to just ask the same question to you. Defund the police. What does that really mean for my audience? Is everybody, I say, from the streets to the seats. You'll have people on here who are in positions of power, whether they faith leaders, whether they business owners, and you'll have people who are everyday people like myself, who are hardworking, raising families. We punch a 9 to 5 clock, whatever you want to classify it as. But we want to understand what it really means to defund the police department.
Yeah, so when we say defund the police, what we are in essence setting up is having a discussion about budgets at the municipal level, budgets at the county level, budgets at the state level, and budget at the federal level. It is also about shining a light on certain things that people may not necessarily be aware, but is important for this conversation, which is, one, the United States as a country spends around $115 billion annually on law enforcement. We spend more on law enforcement than other countries allocate for military spending, right? Mind you, this is not a military spending budget. Our military spending is around $732 billion annually, and it's growing. And that's a separate discussion around military-industrial complex and the work that we need to do to ensure that we are clawing back federal dollars, our tax dollars, back to our communities instead of investing in this military-industrial complex and endless wars. But as a country, what we spend annually is around $115 billion on law enforcement, right? As a state, we spend over $2 billion on our state police and correctional services combined, right? And at the county level, just speaking for Montgomery County, where I live, we spend around $300 million annually on our police department. And so when we're saying defunding the police, this is a budgetary conversation. This is about numbers. This is about budgets as moral documents, right? when we put out a budget and when we pass a budget, it says a lot about what we consider to be a priority and what we consider to be less of a priority. And when we are spending as a country $115 billion annually on law enforcement, when we are spending over $2 billion on the Maryland State Police and Correctional Department combined as a state, and just speaking for my county, spending these hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're still seeing the kind of a disinvestment, the kind of a lines where we don't have enough money in order to pay or to build out or to invest in this community or that community. This is about having those frank conversations. So when we say defund the police, we mean disinvesting in law enforcement and in police and sheriff's departments and reallocating those resources to the communities that need it the most, that are often marginalized, that are often neglected, and where we don't see the kind of resources that we see in other communities. And so this is about a budget discussion, but it is also about policing as well. And more specifically, what we're talking about is the social issues that we don't have the courage in order to face. So much of policing today really is responding to those quality of life issues like homelessness and drug addiction and domestic violence, right? And so when we say defund the police, we are saying we should be investing in other ways to ensure that we're addressing the social issues that we've been neglecting for so long, instead of continuing to spend money on law enforcement and asking them to then go into these communities and respond to these societal issues that we're supposed to be responding to in a different way through our budgetary decisions and through our policy decisions. So that's what we mean when we say defund the police, is calling the question, but more importantly, educating our people around budgets, because ultimately it's our tax dollars that they are using to then prop up a system that supports our brutalization. And so as taxpayers on a fundamental level, we should be demanding and expecting a certain level of service and a certain level of protection. And if we're not receiving that, then we should be looking at these budgets that constitute a lot of our tax dollars, right? And we should be looking at it and demanding that folks shift those funding away from policing and back to our communities where it should be spent.
You on Live with the Chop Shop. We here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. broadcasting from Facebook Live via StreamYard. My brother Ray, I saved you for last, but with a purpose. I wanted to throw the same question at you, but there are many people who criticize, like I did, the fact that people have a tendency to jump on the hot new topic. You, as somebody who has been in and around police advocacy or community advocacy involving policing for these many years, I need you to talk about defunding the police. Is this a new thing? Is this the next new thing? Does it have any real teeth? Talk to us about it, bro.
So when the defund the police whole movement first came about, I recognized the opportunity for the conversation starter. So we have to kind of know, as people that push for legislative and policy changes, that there's a process that has to be initiated, talked about. And for me, defunding the police movement was about educating on how we do exactly what Dayvon and the Delegate said, is how do we actually reallocate these fundings and reimagine what policing actually is in the community. So like Dayvon said, we have to consider the practicality of the word. So to defund the police stops there as the conversation starter. We know the real conversation is, how do we reallocate those funds to more community-based efforts to kind of solve a lot of the problems that both Dayvon and the Delegate talked about, these mental health issues and social work issues and things of that nature. So the first part of it all is actually learning how that affects us, learning that budgetary process, and recognizing, for one, in Baltimore City, how different that mechanism looks for us as opposed to a Montgomery County. So the conversation is real important. It's great that this effort is now getting the attention it needs as far as how police budgets are dispersed and allocated, but this is the beginning of the work. And I think both these guys hit on the exact point is, one, we have to make sure that when we speak on defunding and removing police departments, we have to consider the practicality of it all. So like Dayvon said, we have to ensure that there's a viable mechanism in place to replace the services that we actually need from the police department. So I'm always speaking on being over police, and that's what has to enter this conversation. Like the delegate said, we have to kind of reconsider what first responders we need, and then figure how we reallocate these budget items to those types of organizations. So for every emergency call, the police department doesn't have to be the first responder. They could also be the backup to the necessary response, be it social services, social workers, or mental health officials, or like you say, homeless outreach, or things of that nature, where we have to, one, define what policing is. So we have to recognize that in this country, policing as we know it was created with emancipation. So before the slaves were emancipated, policing pretty much meant, by definition, to keep clean. And law enforcement was left to the sheriffs and whom he deputized. Post-emancipation, we kind of blurred those definitions because of the need for slave owners and former oppressors to be protected from the newly released slaves. So what happens is you deputize the people that cleaned the streets and oversaw the slaves to help control those black people. And that's how you get a police officer from a sheriff or a deputy who is a law enforcement officer. And
I remember learning that when we sat on the CODIF, and you and my good friend, I can't even think of his name, Ed Jackson,
right.
Gave me that whole everything down to Robert Peel and the Palian model of policing and all of those kinds of things. And there's so many things that people really don't know about the history and the context of where police even came from.
Right. And for us, we have to recognize that policing, as we know it right now in the United States, is structured to perpetuate the privilege and racist gains of our oppressors 160 years ago. So really, when we talk about defunding the police, we have to make sure that we are not defunding keeping our communities clean and prosperous. We're defunding these tactics used in actual law enforcement.
Marvin.
Yes, sir, Delegate, come on.
Yeah, just to just bring this home so that folks understand even more just why it is, as talking specifically as Black folks, we not only need to be reading budgets and budget items, but why we need to ensure that we are clawing back resources in our into our communities. I'd like to remind folks that as a state, Maryland spends more on corrections than it does on higher education annually. And this is all while we are being sued as a state by our state's 4 historically Black colleges and universities for being underfunded for hundreds of millions of dollars. So when we talk about defunding the police, yes, it's about social services, but it's about investing that money where it should have been, which is in communities that need it, and communities that will thrive as a result of those intentional investments instead of investing in this police and carceral state that continues and I think it's important to point out, because there are a lot of folks who are talking about why it is that our communities need police and we should not be advocating for defunding the police. But keep in mind that Black communities are the most over-policed communities in the United States. So when we're advocating for additional policing or to fund police and sheriff's departments, in essence, what we are advocating for is greater policing, greater criminalization, greater prosecution, and no real public safety. What we want investments are in the areas that our communities, the most impacted, have identified as the areas that will allow our communities to thrive. And anything other than that is ensuring that our communities remain in a certain socioeconomic status as we see today, not just in Baltimore City, but across the state and across the country. So to bring it home, right, when we talk about our state's 4 HBCUs, 2 of which is in Baltimore City, Coppin State and Morgan State, that the state of Maryland has underfunded these institutions, our institutions, for many years. That we can't find the money in order to correct those injustices, but we're continuing to spend annually more and more on policing, on a carceral state, and on everything that is not a priority that we have identified.
Man, Dayvon, I got to come to you next because I have a Baltimore question for you, right? So I've seen, as we live in this social media society and, people really get the clip on social media, and I've seen a lot of people who are opponents of defunding police always going to their old faithful. You want to defund police and you got 300 murders. Every time a crime is committed in Baltimore, that's another person that is saying this is the reason why we don't need to be talking about defunding police. Can you please talk to that person who doesn't understand the reactive aspect of policing? And I don't even want to guide your statement. Can you please talk to the person who uses we have 300 murders? What about the crime numbers as it pertains to the reality of imbalance that's associated with policing versus the crime numbers that they continue to throw around?
Yep. So three things I want to highlight there. The first is that, and I think I mentioned this the last time I was on, the Fraternal Order of Police is the most powerful police organization in the world. And it is responsible for the most part for why police budgets are so bloated. So when you think about just think about lobbying in general, right? And you think about the fact that there are companies or special interests that pay folks to do advocacy in order to protect their interests. The Fraternal Order of Police has done advocacy, local, state, federal, to be able to get all these dollars to be invested in policing. The reason why that's important is because the FOP has a financial interest in the bloated spending that exists for policing. Combine that with the fact that, and you actually mentioned it on the intro, the kind of promotion for the show, where there's a 36% clearance rate. So if we just go with the argument. Let's just assume what we I think all agree is a bad version of the argument. Let's just assume that police are crucial to being able to address issues of public safety. Part of the problem is that the evidence that the clearance rate is so low clearly demonstrates the fact that the current way that police is constituted is not effective, right? So we paying $500 million for something that isn't actually effectively solving the problem. So what that should say, just from a common sense perspective, if we spending all this money and we're not actually able to accomplish the goal, the stated goal that it's supposed to accomplish, that should tell us that the solution of giving that thing more money to fix a problem it doesn't fix well just doesn't make sense, right? And so I think that's a part of where, to Ray's point about doing this practically, right? Because we understand that as the world currently exists, there are certain places where you would need police, right? Because there aren't institutions stood up at this moment that could do the functions that police, traditionally would do. But I think our conversation should be about how do we begin to build those alternatives. And so one of the things that Delegate Acevero mentioned, this idea of like having, and Ray actually mentioned this too, like having different first responders, right? As one example, right? You know, domestic violence situation, you know, breaks out. I imagine that's a call police don't want to get anyway, right? So how do we build the infrastructure so that there are ways of dealing with that where police aren't a necessary component of that? The last thing I'll say, the third point I want to make is that one of the complicated things about defunding police, and this is the part where we need your viewers' help and all the community advocates' help. The most complicated thing about defunding police and changing the police culture, I mentioned the FOP, and a part of what they've done is that there have been times in previous sessions where they coalesce, they form relationships with other unions, because the FOP is fundamentally a union, right? And a big part of why the budget's so high, I think I read something in the Sun the other day where Michael Harrison and Commissioner Harrison, in response to this defund police piece, says that 180 million of the 500 million is pensions and stuff that they're obligated to pay for police officers, right? So I think we have to do the work as a community of not letting the FOP hide behind labor, because they're going to frame all this stuff in terms of, well, police have rights as workers, right? And I think we have to get to a place where we understand that the history and the culture of policing needs to change. And a lot of the protections that they get from, like, the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, which essentially is a policy that gives police essentially all these protections, that they equate to the protections that a public sector worker might get, right? If you work for DPW and you do sanitation, right? Or if you just work in any other public, facing or public service profession, that there's certain protection you get as a worker. We have to be bold enough to tell our elected officials that, yeah, the FOP is going to reach out to the many major unions that fund people's campaigns, that a lot of our people belong to. And we have to have the will to say back to the FOP, you're on your own. Like, it makes sense for public sector workers who don't have the ability to kill people. It makes sense for them to be able to have the kind of protections. But when we talk about law enforcement, like, we need to make sure that we have actual oversight. And the union has created policies like the LEOBR that make it so that we don't get to have oversight, right? So we spending all this money on policing, and we don't even get a say as to how we get to manage the nature of them rendering service that are really public goods that we're entitled to. And so we're going to need the help of the community to really raise that issue to say, look, you can't hide behind labor. Y'all don't need this level of protections in order to do your job. And in fact, the kind of protections that the FOP wants are the kind of protections that get in the way of actual good police, but also get in the way of actually being able to really address the issue of public safety. We're not going to be able to address public safety really unless we're able to change how policing is done. And if the FOP has a monetary interest in those big budgets, they will keep saying, let's fund what we're doing. And we all know that what they've been doing hasn't worked.
Yeah.
Delegate Acevero. I'm not as familiar with Montgomery County as I am with Baltimore, but my work doing violence prevention and intervention with teens has brought me to the reality that there are some issues in communities in Montgomery County that I never knew existed. I always heard of Montgomery County and thought about it as, Gaithersburg and all of the places that are known as some of the richest counties in the country, not just in the state of Maryland, but in the country, only for me to find out that they have housing developments and some of the same real issues that you would see in any urban setting. That being the case, you're responding as a delegate that's advocating to defund police, to somebody is saying, what about all that violence and crime and all of the stuff that's happening down here? What's the response?
Yes, I think it's important for your viewers to know that Montgomery County is, as of 2015, a majority people of color county. The district that I represent, District 39, is in the northwestern part of Montgomery County and is one of the most diverse districts in the state and in the country. Black, Latinx, Asian American and Pacific Islanders make up the majority. We have a huge immigrant community. I myself, being an immigrant, women make up the majority. So we're a very diverse district, and we're a very diverse county. But what I also try to remind folks is that we're often seen as this affluent jurisdiction where there are pockets of poverty, when in reality there is a lot of poverty in our county, and there are pockets of wealth. And that means that we have to respond to those needs and to those communities differently. When we look at our education system, the majority of the students that we add every single year to our school system, which is the largest in the state, are Black and Latinx kids. When we talk about the increase in Title I schools, not just in my district, but across our county. And another thing that we're looking at is a lot of overcrowding within our schools. And so my focus is ensuring that we are investing in education and not building a policing and a carceral state. One of my favorite quotes is from the poet Victor Hugo, who once said that when we open schools, we close prisons. And so when a lot of people shirk away from this terminology of what it means to be a prison abolitionist, it means for us to invest in things that will make prisons obsolete. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about defunding the police. It's about prioritizing the areas and the communities that we should have been prioritizing, where this idea of a militarized police is not necessary, where we don't need to see them on our streets. And I'd like to just come back to three things that Dayvon mentioned that I think is very important for your viewers. And one is the role of the FOP in this entire process, the Fraternal Order of Police, which is an organization that fancies itself a union. It is not within the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor Council of Industrial Organizations, which is the overarching umbrella for all labor unions. They are not within the AFL-CIO, but oftentimes they do work with other labor unions to stop or to stymie police accountability legislation that our communities have been calling for a number of years. And this is important because, as Dayvon rightly pointed out, we as Black people, as Black workers, some of us are members of unions. And if we are members of unions, then we should certainly be active and speaking out and letting folks know that the kind of policies that they should be advocating for in city halls and county council buildings and in state capitals and on the Hill are policies that will ensure that when Black workers clock out, that we are going back to communities that are thriving, that are not over-policed. And it's important for us to build a labor movement that isn't confined to the walls of our workplace, but instead extends into our communities, right? If you're fighting for economic justice and you say you care about racial justice means also standing up for police accountability legislation. And as a labor organizer and as the son of a labor activist, I understand that labor unions are complicit in this. And that's the question that we have to pose to our unions, all of us who are part of unions, particularly the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. What is it that we are doing to bring about the kind of transparency and accountability and justice our communities are calling for? And lastly is Dayvon mentioned the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. I cannot stress this enough. We need to know what that document, that law, which is fundamentally flawed, what it is about, and how it prevents the transparency, accountability, and justice that our communities are calling for. And the simple answer is that it prevents that in many ways. And so we are calling for its repeal, and everyone should be contacting their state delegates and state senators to repeal that document that protects corrupt and racist cops.
So I'm coming to you, Ray. There was a question. Shaq, can we get the question up? The one right before, and we got our very own Senator Jill Carter on with us. And I believe that this defunding police may be an ongoing conversation where we're going to have to get you back on because you really are taking care of our comment section right now. Is there any campaign in place to ask our legislators to pledge not to accept any money from the FOP? And our very own Senator Jill Carter said, yes, there is, and they're currently looking for a link. So I want all of our viewers tonight to look for that link. But I want to ask the question to you, Ray, as a person who you're currently heavily involved in the consent decree, from a community perspective as well as being a part of the monitoring team and things of that nature. Over your years as a community advocate for fair and for fair policing, how do these side deals, amongst this old boys network really impact? And I'm talking because we're going to have this conversation about what needs to happen in Annapolis versus what's happening in Annapolis with this next wave of questions. But how do these side deals with this old boy network that continues to happen? How is it isolating us from being able to get the change that we need to see?
Well, I think in Baltimore we have compounded issues with beyond just the old boy network. We have old legislation. We're not really a city agency. We're a state agency, and really we have a establishment that's been not accountable to anyone for years. So it's kind of hard to break that actual culture. And that's why we are under a consent decree. And that's why we have to kind of push to make sure we get this stuff done. I feel like in the past 4 or 5 years, what we haven't had is stability in our representation to actually commit to making this a priority. So I think, once again, as we call for attention to the process and the discussion about what this really means, that we actually have to have an intentional conversation in Baltimore focused on how do we incorporate policing into the real conversation, which is public safety. And right now, I think it's up to us to kind of force that mandate on the police department to dismantle that good old boy network, because there's still an embedded culture of policing in Baltimore City and around the country for real that we've yet to overcome.
So we hear that all the time, the need to be able, Dayvon, to kind of attack the structure and the institution that's in place. But one of the things that was just asked by Brother Malcolm Ruff, what do you all propose should replace Leober to bring accountability and oversight to public safety in Maryland? Now, before you do that, answer that question directly. I want you to give us a little bit of history around Leober and how it came to be, because that's another one of those things that I was fascinated by when I learned about it during my time in CODIV. And then go right into how you, and I know what the answers are, but I'm here tonight to make sure that your voices are heard. So go right into what do we propose in opposition to Leober?
So to the history, Maryland actually has a pretty interesting place in the history of law enforcement officer bills of rights that exist around the country. So Maryland is one of 16 states that have a law enforcement officer bill of rights. It's framed in many respects, when you read the actual statute, it reads in many respects like a labor agreement. And a big part of what it does, with the way it's functioned, it was codified in 1972 or 1974. But in 1975, the Maryland FOP actually hosted a national conference. I believe it was on the Eastern Shore of FOPs around the country, because they saw how valuable of a tool it was to have a law enforcement officer bill of rights. And so it includes things like, one of the things that I think is the most easiest to explain, you have things like officers have, it was at one point 10 days, now it's 5 business days before they're required to make a statement on the record when they've alleged to have engaged in misconduct, right? Or that the only people that are authorized to engage in the internal investigation of an allegation of misconduct is sworn law enforcement, right? So those are just 2 examples of the ways in which police are allowed to police themselves that are enabled by the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights and our mandates, so that individual municipalities can't go outside of that. The solution, so a part of, LBS is one of, I think, 60 organizations at this point that have put forward kind of a preliminary set of demands around what the legislature should do in 2021. And one of them is a full repeal, ideally a full repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. There's some people's immediate reaction to that would be, Well, that's completely one-sided, right? You're giving too much or not giving any leverage to law enforcement. What I would say is that the traditional mechanism of negotiation should be in the hands of the union and the municipality, right? So in terms of whatever protections that each municipality deems is necessary for law enforcement, work that out in the process of the negotiation between the individual municipality and law enforcement, right? Because what the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights does is that it creates this statewide mandate that cannot be superseded by local municipalities, where then the FOP has certain things they don't even have to negotiate, right? So that what was a 10-day rule, now 5 business day rule, they don't even have to negotiate, right? Because that's state law that can't be touched, right? And so what needs to happen is if you repeal it, then the two sides can just negotiate, and that's a place where our vote then matters, like our political organizing matters. Because then as we elect mayor, because what a mayor could reasonably say, and this is what past mayors have said, what mayors can reasonably say is, ain't a whole lot we can do. The state has all the power because of the LEOBR. So we get it, but we can't really touch it. What repealing the LEOBR does is now the accountability is on the administration. So now we can go to the mayor and say, okay, we count on you to negotiate a contract that will not give police all these protections, right? And so I think that's the alternative to LEOBR, repeal it and let the municipalities negotiate on what is in the contracts, municipality, by municipality, instead of giving the FOP all that leverage that allows them to do what they've been doing.
And protection by state law. You on Live with the Chop Shop. We on every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. right here on Facebook Live via StreamYard. Delegate Acevero, what does it take to repeal LEOBR?
The same thing that it takes to get anything done in state capitals and in places of power, which is us as people having the will and organizing, as Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture once will often put it, organizing is the tool of the oppressed. And so if we're acknowledging that certain communities across, whether it's Baltimore City, Montgomery County, or the state of Maryland, or this country, that are being disproportionately impacted by an oppressive system, then we must organize as a people. We must not only educate ourselves, and this is why we're talking about laws like the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which Maryland was the first state to pass in the early 1970s, in essence, giving this blueprint to America on how to protect corrupt and racist cops. And I think what's important in this conversation when we talk about LEOBR as a labor document and labor unions and workers' rights, today at 1 p.m., we had our first meeting of the Police Accountability Work Group. And one of my colleagues, Delegate Deborah Davis from Charles County, had pointed out something that is absolutely true. And I know this as a union organizer myself, is that, if we were to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, this in no way means that workers no longer have protections. There is federal legislation like the National Labor Relations Act. There are certain state laws around collective bargaining for public employees that would still ensure that these workers have protection. What this is an excuse or a veneer that the Fraternal Order of Police and other labor unions who must be called out when we're having this conversation, they hide behind this veneer of this is a labor document and this is about workers' rights. And the reality of it is, if we all agree that police violence is an issue, and I would hope that more of my colleagues in the General Assembly would agree with that, then we should be removing the mechanisms. We should be removing or repealing the systems and the policies that perpetuate violence against Black people, against Indigenous people, against Latinx people, against LGBTQ plus people, because this is a fight that has a lot of intersectionalities for a lot of other communities, right? June is Pride Month, right? Where the LGBTQ plus community sort of talk about the Stonewall riots. But even that movement came out of police brutalization. And so we as a people should be organizing and working with other communities, including the Latinx community, right? Because they are also impacted on this issue, to ensure that we're dismantling the systems and the policies that support this kind of a brutalization and protect corrupt and racist cops. And the LEOBR is a part of that.
Can I jump in?
Can I jump in real quick?
I want to ask you a specific question, and then I'll come right to you, Dayvon, because some of the things that I've seen is, as we see basically our African American community begin to organize, you see people who are in a lot of cases, and I'm gonna just say what it is, you see the LGBTQ community who voices their opinion or voices their need for advocacy in a way that seems to be in spite of what the Black community or Black and brown communities are doing in general. Then we've seen where there are women's groups who also come out and say Black women are victimized by Black men. Then you see you have people who ask the question that during the most recent Baltimore protests, you didn't see a Hispanic-led protest, while Hispanics are impacted greatly by these police issues. What would you say are the challenges to the coming together, where it seems like there is so much intersectionality of the issues for all of these populations?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. I think I want to push back on a couple of things. One, and I think it's important to acknowledge this. There would be no LGBTQ plus movement if it were not for Black and Latinx, queer and trans people who decided that instead of being thrown out, that they were going to throw bricks at the system. And in fact, people like Marsha P. Johnson and Silva Rivera, who have been fighting police brutalization for a number of years, were the people who are in the forefront of that movement, right? And Black LGBTQ plus people have always understood that we exist at that intersectionality, and that means that we are impacted in many ways. And so we have always showed up for that fight. I won't agree that LGBTQ plus people do not show up to that fight. Black LGBTQ plus people, Latinx, LGBTQ plus people of color have and continue to show up for this fight. The issue lies with white LGBTQ plus people who historically have been advocating for policies and issues that fit, in essence, their community, and don't pay particular attention to the issues that Black and brown LGBTQ plus people have been fighting for some years. Good example. I was a part of the marriage equality fight here in Maryland, but I also recognize that this was a concern of the white LGBTQ plus community. When we go to Black queer communities, we see that whether it's youth homelessness, whether it's discrimination in employment and housing, whether it's police brutalization, those are the issues that we continue to talk about. So I want to lift up those individuals and organizations that have been speaking out and continue to speak out against police violence. What we need is white LGBTQ plus folks who are affluent, well-to-do, oftentimes don't live in the impoverished and rural communities that we live in. Those are the people we need to be inviting in and holding accountable, because there would be no Stonewall if it weren't for us fighting the police, right? As far as Latinx and Hispanic people, as someone that identifies Afro-Latino, I can tell you that there is intersectionality for this issue, right? There are Black Latinos, and there are Black Latinos who have been present and have been showing up to this fight for a very long time, myself included. Even before I ran for the General Assembly, I was in the streets of Baltimore City and in Annapolis, seeing the kind of games people were playing when it came to the issues that we were saying our communities would like to see, right? And we ended up passing cosmetic legislation. And this is why we're having this conversation right now, 5 years after Freddie Gray, 4 years after Sister Corin Gaines was killed in Baltimore County, right? 2 years after Anton Black and Robert White in my county was killed, right? And so we have named legislation after Anton Black called Anton's Law that will begin to address those inadequacies in state law. But we need to build solidarity, because the only way we defeat racism is with solidarity, right? And that means building coalitions with other impacted communities so that we're dismantling the system in a very strategic way.
Dayvon, you got it, man.
Yep, and I think, and this dovetails actually really nicely with what Delegate Acevero just mentioned, which is that one of the mistakes that I think is often made And I think it's a mistake that is made. It's an honest mistake where people are so frustrated with the kind of political establishment, and they're so frustrated with just how things are, that there's sometimes, broad statements about, who's not doing what. So a part of the point I want to make is that to the initial question you asked, Delegate Acevero, about like what can people do, it's going to be very important for people to support those legislators that are champions on this issue. And it's going to be very important that we as a community support legislators that are going to speak as forcefully to this issue as possible. Right. And so, we talked about, Senator Carter, who, has been a champion on these issues for a long time. I thought it was important to have, Delegate Acevero, because he's somebody that's, been a champion on these issues before in the legislature and now as a delegate in the legislature. And so I think it's important for folks to be able to provide support for those kind of legislators. I want to give an example of a contrast. So there was a op-ed written in Maryland Matters recently. It's written by a delegate out of Charles County named C.T. Wilson, right? C.T. Wilson is a Black delegate, Charles County, and he wrote, and basically his op-ed was, the top of it was, Black people actually really like law enforcement. We actually like law and order. We just want more effective law and order. We actually need better training. He suggested that it's important for police officers to have military grade training so that they have more discipline and physical encounters with folks. And one of the points he makes is that you shouldn't be a police officer unless you can effectively, physically subdue a person. And the reason why I raise that is because a part of the concern that I have is that the legislature will pick certain champions on the issue for whom will give versions of the perspective that, many of us will find problematic, because the issue isn't we like law and order. The issue isn't that we just need, more and better police. We need to reimagine what police looks like, and we need community oversight over law enforcement. And he mentions community oversight kind of towards the bottom, right? But doesn't mention really the FOP as really being an enemy of progress on this issue. And so a part of the point I want to make when you ask the question again, especially back to Delegate Acevero, which is, what can folks do? What is it going to take? It's going to take the community getting behind those that are like true champions on the issue that's about justice, and being able to distinguish between those folks and folks that are going to be put in position. Because when I saw that Maryland Matters op-ed, my first initial thought was, oh, he's going to be somebody they put out there to try to be a champion and try to go with his perspective. And we need the community to know the difference. We need the community to know that it's a big difference between Delegate Acevero and Delegate C.T. Wilson. No disrespect to the brother, right? It's not personal. But when he wrote his op-ed, what I'm clear about is we don't have the same perspective. And his perspective is not rooted in the kind of politics of liberation that's really necessary for this moment.
So let me come to you, Ray, because Senator Carter just put in there, they choose the ones they control, and that's the bottom line. And I want to thank her for her comments tonight. I want to thank Nika. So many people are chiming in. But Ray, I want to come to you because you have a very unique seat in this conversation, and I'm going to go ahead and poke the bear as it pertains to this. You have a position in the consent decree, right? The consent decree didn't directly make provisions for defunding police or anything to do with that type of conversation. And really, many people question even the very effectiveness of the consent decree, right? From a person who is a community advocate, I want to be clear about that, a community advocate who has fought for accountability in policing. You're working specifically and directly to bring the community towards the conversation of the consent decree. However, the outcry now is defund police. Is there a balance between those two for you as a person who works in it and from the perspective of community understanding?
So for me, we have to recognize that we do have a consent decree. We are obligated to fulfill the mandates, and there are budgetary obligations that the police department will be forced to adopt in terms of extra trainings, technology mandates, and things of that nature, where that's the only way the consent decree actually affects the budget. We knew going in that the consent decree doesn't supersede any state laws. So from our advocacy point, it's always been the same, that we have to push all of this to a policy perspective. I think, once again, because of the continued state of our city, it's been hard to maintain gravitation to the consent decree. We've had so many other influences on public opinion where the consent decree is kind of named in the afterthought when we're talking about all of these other issues that the cities has with the police department as well as public safety. So I think those two are not mutually exclusive, but the consent decree, which works upon a timeline, has it laid out how this will actually be implemented. And I think, once again, that influence and prioritizing of the mandates in the consent decree has to be echoed and amplified by our representatives and community. So we know it's rough times in Baltimore City. The consent decree will get blamed, just like legislation was blamed before the consent decree when there's still issues. But for us as community advocates, we know that the bottom line is we have to keep fighting until the actual change comes. So the consent decree for Baltimore City is probably the sharpest and the newest tools that any city has for police reform in the country. And I think what has to happen is we got to get some mechanics out there in our legislation to actually know how to wield these tools and make them effective and make them a priority, feel the sense of urgency that the impacted communities actually felt when we fought for a consent decree.
I want to swing over to you, Dayvon. Senator Carter said the consent decree was specifically negotiated to comply with racist, oppressive, that impede accountability. I want to say from my work on the CODIF, I was flabbergasted by a few things because I came in not having a lot of experience and understanding the legislation and all of those sort of things, but to know that as we talk about oversight and accountability being one of the main components that has brought about reform in places where it's been implemented effectively, that there was no real the recommendations that CODIF were to make and actually made have no cemented place in the consent decree, right? That's one, that we were to make recommendations, but the recommendations had no real strength, even in the consent decree, for their deployment into process and procedures. I sat in the city solicitor's office one day in a meeting as we aggressively sought them to, as one of the parties, go to Judge Bradar and ask the judge to make the recommendations that came out of CODIF an actual fixture, something that had to be implemented, just like the technology, the training, and some of the other things that are check marks, right? And we were flat out told no. Then there was another place that kind of really got to me when I realized that whatever we came up with would still be kind of overshadowed by legislation like Leober and things of that nature. Talk to me, man, as a person who goes to Annapolis, a person who does this work, a person that really assisted, worked with us, and walked with us through the process of coming up with community or oversight recommendations and things of that nature. Where is a person like yourself, right? Where are you really at with this consent decree? Does it create lanes for the the defunding or a level of policy and things of that nature to be implemented that can bring about real change. I want the people to hear what your perspective is as it pertains to this.
So consent decrees can be tools. It's important for people to understand what actually a consent decree is. As I understand it, a consent decree is an agreement between two parties, in this case, the Department of Justice and the Baltimore City Police Department, an agreement where a judge has been put in place to essentially help to manage a process by which the policies of the police department are changed in order to accomplish the goal of having more accountable policing, right? Just to put it very succinctly, with a threat to sue, right? So it's one of those things where it's like, the DOJ is exercising its power, its discretion because they could have just sued Baltimore City Police Department, right? And made changes that way. A consent decree is kind of the middle ground, right? It's important to know that consent decrees is something that actually are very common, right? So there are lots of, so for instance, Baltimore City's Department of Social Services is under a consent decree and been under a consent decree, I think, for almost 30 years, right? There's a consent decree with Baltimore City, I believe the EPA. So there are consent decrees that, Prince George's County Police Department was under consent decree for a period of time. So consent decrees are not like these anomalies, these things that happen once in a while. Consent decrees are pretty common. And so to Brother Ray's point, consent decrees can be tools if they're crafted in such a way that lends itself to really giving power to the community to set the agenda for what the policies and procedures for the police department would be. And the extent to which, like, my own involvement and LBS's involvement was in the beginning trying to help push the consent decree, in terms of the language of it, to be more about giving community power over decisions that are made about policy within the police department, right? Now, I wasn't satisfied with the outcome of that. I do think it's important to have people like Ray on the inside, right, who can push from that perspective in order to try to push for something that would be, as helpful as possible. That being said, one of the things that LBS said, and our director of research actually wrote a wonderful piece back when they were negotiating it back in 2016, where he kind of ran through the different contenders for the monitors and went through just like the different things that we should be considering. In this moment, police reform is a highly marketable social justice commodity. Consent decrees all over the country, a big part of them as it relates to policing. There are a lot of national organizations for whom their professional careers and their ability to, quite frankly, write grants to get paid to do work on litigation having to do with consent decrees or advocacy about them. There's lots of incentive that there has been to put the focus on the consent decree as this kind of overarching thing that's going to solve the problems of law enforcement. Now, those who are in the know have never made that claim. Like Brother Ray has never made the claim that the consent decree is going to be this major force towards police reform. I think the point that Brother Ray has made is it's a tool that can be used to address the policies within the police department. But the consent decree is very limited because, as I've mentioned before and other guests have mentioned before, law enforcement, as a matter of policy, is the providence of state and local law. The federal government does not have jurisdiction over local and state law enforcement policy. So the consent decree is, at best, is an agreement to incentivize a police department for whom its own internal policies can be improved to be more accountable. That is separate and different, and in my estimation, not as big of a priority as the state legislation that will create the openings necessary to really transform the police department in a way that, maybe one day can be abolished and we have an entirely different apparatus for law enforcement. But if we were moving towards a more community-based alternatives approach to community safety, it's the state legislation that's going to do that. The consent decree doesn't really get at that, and it doesn't get at that in a way that we're going to see a whole lot of observable outcomes as a result.
Thank you. Delegate Acevero, you still with us?
Yes, sir. We here.
We got to get ready to start to wrap this puppy up, man. But I first of all, I want to say thank you to each and every one of y'all. We're not at the actual wrap up point, but man, this has been so insightful and so enlightening. The audience is still engaged. We still around 60 viewers. What I want to get you guys to do right now, publicly and on camera, is commit to coming back with me soon. And when I say soon, I mean maybe in the next week or so, to continue to have this dialogue. It's a dialogue that I see people are still very engaged in. And we have a lot of people who want to know. This platform is not about novelty. It's an opportunity for the voices that matter, the people who can speak the necessary language in layman's terms, but with all of the proper diction for policy, legislation. That's one of the things I've always loved about my big brother Ray, is he's been an educator to me, helping me to understand from the policy to the street level. And that's what this show is about. So if I can get you guys to commit to come back on, that we may be able to do a part 2 of this show sooner than later, because it's very, very important that we continue this dialogue. That being said, I want to go right around the spectrum to give you guys the opportunity to have, for tonight, final words, some closing remarks, what directions and instructions you want to give to the almost 60 people that we still have on this broadcast, as we look to move forward until we come back to finish this dialogue. Ray, can we start with you, big bro?
Well, I think for me, it's going to be the same as everybody else. Is we got to focus now on how we finally focus on changing the legislative oppressive policies that's been perpetuating this for over a century. And I think we followed the lead of those that know this legislative process locally and the advocates and representatives that can get us there.
Thank you. That's it, bro?
That's it, man. I think if
that's
get involved, be involved in the
I was surprised. I ain't gonna lie.
Of preparing for January.
I was surprised, man. I ain't gonna lie. But I'm
in another place right now.
So I do want to say, Dean Lines, my name on Facebook is Marvin McKenstry Jr. Please inbox me that person's information, and it may be a possibility to bring them on when we do the follow-up show. Dean Lines commented that there's a group out of young African Americans that has drafted some legislation called Breathe. And I want to, are you familiar with Breathe, a young and growing movement that is trying to implement legislation that will defund police? Dean, I'm going to be completely honest with you. We going to vet them. And if it's somebody, now we don't vet for agreement. We're not vetting them to see if we agree, but to see if they are a viable and credible voice to our communities concerning this topic. And I'll actually consider bringing them on for the follow-up show. But Delegate Acevero, I want to give you the opportunity now, while we still have 60 people on this broadcast. And if it wasn't for my engineer and me loving him enough to release him to be able to have a life this evening, we wouldn't even be cutting it off. But since I got the commitment, I want each of y'all to voice your commitment to come back and do a part 2 of this conversation. Delegate Acevero, give us some closing remarks, please.
You know, I want to thank you again for the invitation, and to my brother Dayvon Love for allowing me to be a part of this conversation, a really important conversation. As an organizer, I always believe in call to actions and action items after every discussion. And I'll continue to say that organizing is the tool of the oppressed. And so as oppressed people, we must not only understand who represents us, so everyone needs to know who their 3 state delegates, or in some instances, 1 or 2 state delegates and state senators are. Meaning, who are the people that represent you in Annapolis? You need to know who they are And you also need to be in touch with them and let them know what our demands are. And the only way you can let them know our demands is when you are following organizations like Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, like ACLU of Maryland, following trusted legislators like Senator Jill P. Carter from Baltimore City, others like Eric Barron, myself, on this issue, and ensuring that you are making the demands of your elected officials the demands that are rooted in our communities. Those closest to the pain are closest to the solution. And there have been a number of times that we presented solutions to police violence, and it's time that we ensure that our elected officials listen to us and we echo what those solutions are. And so they put out, and LBS is a part of this group, they put out 5 recommendations that include repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, that include transparency in police misconduct investigations, that include getting police and law enforcement out of schools, that include independence for Baltimore City Police Department, so that the people in that city are having greater control over their police departments and the way public safety is administered. But we have to know all these things, and then we have to make those demands of our elected officials. I would also make a plug that folks check out my piece that I recently wrote in Maryland Matters, titled "When Pain is the Prerequisite for Progress." And this is a piece that I wrote, not just reflecting on my time doing this work, but also speaking to the kind of solutions that we need, such as the passage of Anton's Law, named after Anton Black. If you are out here rightfully calling for justice for George Floyd and for Sister Corin Gaines and Brother Freddie Gray, you should also know who Anton Black is, and you should also be calling justice for Anton Black and his family. And we should be supporting Anton's Law and calling for the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And lastly, I will also say that when the cameras have left, when the clout leaders have left, when the crowds have gone back into their homes, and when the sensationalism around Black death has dissipated, are we going to show up in these spaces of power, meaning not just in city halls and county council buildings, but in Annapolis, in your state capital, because state legislatures are in the driver's seat of this issue. And so the real question is, when all of that comes to an end, and we know it will, because there's always a sensationalism around Black death until that time passes, are we going to continue to show up as oppressed people? And are we going to demand that the people, non-Black people who call themselves allies, are they going to show up and demand that these systems and policies be dismantled? So continue to organize, continue to be engaged, and follow what it is that folks like Dayvon and organizations like LBS and Senator Jill P. Carter and myself are doing in Annapolis. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Acevero. Dayvon, I saved you for last, man. I wanted you to be able to not only speak to this in the tone of Baltimore advocate like Ray, but because you have a voice to that mighty millennial group that's out there, that's organizing, that has decided that they're no longer going to take this. Can you give us some closing remarks with respect to all of those elements? And again, I need to hear, because I ain't heard from Ray or Delegate Acevero yet in their closing remarks, but I'm going to ask y'all again. I need to hear your verbal commitment to come back and continue this conversation.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely, come back. I want to say again, I really, enjoyed this conversation. Really appreciated, having a conversation with the brothers that, was in this conversation about policing, and look forward to expanding the conversation, to have other voices involved that also can lend themselves and their expertise to this topic. So just a lot of appreciation. Last thing I want to say is, and this just really echoes both what Brother Ray said and what Delegate Acevero said. And there are 5 names that I want to give your audience that are going to be really important. See, part of the issue when you think about, like, how is it that folks who are in power came to power? So, brief history lesson, when you think about the conservative revolution, right? The response to the civil rights movement and all the other movements that were, Black Power movement, environmental movement, women's, all that. The response were conservatives went and built institutions. and they built institutions to be able to create a policy platform that then they can use to be able to give their playbook to conservatives, take over local legislatures, take over state houses, and force their agenda. And it culminated in the election of 1980, in the election of Ronald Reagan. Similar to what we have today, Donald Trump is not an anomaly, right? There was the Tea Party movement, right, that organized and took over state houses and state legislative seats, really, super conservative, many of which sympathizes to white nationalists, to create the kind of political environment that a Donald Trump can be elected president. So the local stuff is local, but it sets the tone for national stuff, and it sets the tone for what policies are able to be made through. And so it's important that as a community, we're equipped with the information about who to target, because sometimes we blame stuff on the mayor don't have power over, right? Some people might go and yell at the mayor about education, well, the mayor don't have much control. In Baltimore City, the mayor don't have much control over that. And so it's important to know who to go after, who actually has the power to address the things we want to address. I want to give 5 names. First 2 names I want to give are the chairs of the judicial committees, both in the House and the Senate, right? So on the House, we're talking about Luke Clippinger, who's a state delegate, represents the 46th district in Baltimore City. So a Baltimore City delegate is the chair. Chairs have tremendous power. They essentially decide what will come through their committee and what goes to the entire floor. So Luke Clippinger, state delegate represents a large swath of South Baltimore, Southwest Baltimore. Luke Clippinger, he's a state delegate, 46th district. And because he's Baltimore City, we have a lot of sway over what he does. So it's important and I saw Miss Cynthia Gross say that she lives in the 46th district. So we need people like Miss Cynthia and others to really get on Luke Clippinger to make sure that whatever bill comes through his committee is a bill that us and our networks are satisfied with. Second name, Will Smith. He is the chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. That's the committee that Senator Jill Carter is on. Will Smith is a delegate out of Montgomery County. He's someone that I've, been able to develop a pretty decent relationship with. I still think he hasn't proven himself in terms of being a staunch champion for racial justice. And so I would put the challenge to him, and need your viewers to put the challenge to him. This is his opportunity to step up and really show, whether he's really going to be a champion on these issues. This is his opportunity to really do it. So that's the second name. The third name is Vanessa Atterbury. Delegate Vanessa Atterbury is the vice chair of the House Judicial Proceedings Committee. So she's the vice chair to Luke Clippinger that I mentioned earlier. But she also was designated by the Speaker of the House of Delegates to chair the police work group that Delegate Acevero mentioned earlier that had meeting at 1 p.m. today. So Vanessa Atterbury chairs that committee. She's a delegate out of Howard County. So it's going to be important. If you know people in Howard County, it's going to be important that you get folks to reach out and make sure you press her to make sure that the legislation that comes out of the work group, because that work group is going to have a lot of influence on what bill comes out. It's going to be really important that as a chair, she's moving stuff that's quality stuff. Last 2 names, very important. First is our new Speaker of the House of Delegates, Adrienne Jones. First Black person and first woman to be the Speaker of the Maryland House of Delegates, right? Very big historic accomplishment. It's going to be she's a delegate out of Baltimore County, like the Randallstown area, Marysville area. It's going to be important. If you know people who live Randallstown, that kind of Marysville, that Liberty Heights corridor or Liberty Road corridor, people in that general area, one of the most powerful person in the chamber. So it's going to be important that people reach out, call, and again, say to her, whatever legislation comes out of this work group and whatever legislation passes the floor, she needs to be on board with what our networks are satisfied with. Last name, Bill Ferguson. Bill Ferguson is the new Senate president, right? He succeeds Senate President Mike Miller, who was Senate president for about 33 years. So Bill Ferguson's the new Senate president. He's the state senator who also represents the 46th district. 46th district is South Baltimore, all those different places around South Baltimore. It's going to be important. Reach out to him, call him, most important person in that chamber. And so it's going to be important for your listeners who live in those parts of Baltimore City to really get on Senator Ferguson, Senate President Ferguson, and again, to make sure that whatever comes out of the Senate is what is necessary with us and our networks of support, what the community says is going to be satisfactory in terms of legislation. So I just wanted to give your audience those 5 names, because those are 5 names that you're going to hear a lot about during session on this issue.
Man, I appreciate you guys tonight. I want to again thank you, and I'm going to thank you one more time before we get off the air. I do want to say we have a dynamic show coming up on Thursday. Shock, if we can get everything loaded up for that show, we're going to be, if you notice, there's kind of a tone that's been set on the Chop Shop. On Tuesdays, we kind of have more of a political focus, and then on Thursdays, we're doing some direct addressing of the violence in our community. So the question that came out of the protest was, what about the violence in Baltimore? And we've had a continuum of conversations about the violence. And this week, it's going to be a real good one. I'm going to let this video play, then I'm going to come back and tell you a little bit more. So you see it this Thursday, we're going to be talking to 4 very credible messengers about the need to directly impact the violence through mentor programs. These are 4 people who literally kind of launched out with just intention to do some good, and God has given such great increase. We're going to have on there Cameron Miles, who to me, in my estimation, is the father of mentoring here in Baltimore, with his mentoring male teens in the hood program. We're going to have on Damian Cooper, awesome man of God who has Project Newmar that is doing great things in our city, impacting our youth. We have my brother and my friend, Jarrell Wilson, who is the founder of For My Kids, and one who continues to carry on the legacy of Keon Carpenter, due to great work that Keon has started here in Baltimore with youth through athletics and beyond. And we have Tagana Duncan, who is at Fraternal Templeton Elementary School, who's doing great things with his project, the STAND program, bringing men together to mentor young men in that school. We had over 300 men respond when he had his annual basketball game this year. And the 300 men were there, sadly, to make sure that there was a man figure with each of the young men in the school that didn't have one. So you hear the disparaging numbers. We're going to come on and we're going to talk about the violence from the perspective of direct intervention by mentoring our young men. I'm excited about that show on Thursday. Again, I want to thank everybody that thought it not robbery to come on tonight to be with me. Delegate Acevero, you have my sincere thanks and gratitude. I'll be excited to see you back on. Ray, always consistent, always my big bro, always educating the people. I thank you so much for being on again. This is your second trip, and you too, Dayvon, my little brother. I thank God that when I look at us, I can see generationally the continuation of the important work, because this is definitely one that's going to be needing to continue. I want to thank my right hand and my left hand, my main man, Shaka Pitts, who's behind the scenes making the magic happen. While we're on this broadcast, I want to thank the LBS group for allowing us to broadcast from their page. Our viewership has been off the chain the entire show. I gotta get my following up, man. The numbers have been crazy. I want to thank you, our viewing and listening audience. My favorite people, some of my favorite people. Senator Jill Carter has been on with us the entire time. Nika Namdi, Miss Diane Connolly, we thank you. Sandra Sermons have been on. I even seen producer and actress Sonja Song jumped on and dropped a comment. Miss Erica Davies, Dean Lines. I just thank all of y'all for coming on, because there's no need to have these conversations if there's not an audience to listen. And last and most importantly, I gotta thank my co-host. She has been by my side all my life, and she's right here with me for every show. And I need y'all to understand why this is major, because it's way past her bedtime. 6 o'clock, 6:30, she will check out on me. But when I'm on here, she is right here. Mama, I love you. You want to say anything to the people? No?
I'm going to bed.
She said, no, she ain't rocking with y'all. She want to go to bed. Senator Carter has dealt with this sleepy lady direct, face-to-face. I just want to share this word of encouragement with us. As I said, this is something we got to be in for the long haul. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58 says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. This is the work of the Almighty that we're doing. I'm at a place in my walk with God that I don't care what you choose to call them, but you got to understand the divine impact of gifts that have been given to the work of saving our people. Listen, y'all, you got to understand that from 1619 to 2019 was the 400 years that was talked about in the enslavement of Abraham's seed. If you don't know who you are, I'm going to let you go look that one up. But we are in a divine place as we've crossed out of 2019 into 2020. There is a very real revolution. But even in that, when the popularity of it is gone and all of those things, we have got to stay committed. We've got to be steadfast. We've got to be unmovable. We've got to be always abounding in the divine work of the Lord, knowing that our labor is not in vain in the Lord. Thank you for riding out with me tonight. I love everybody on here. Again, I'm your host, Pastor Marvin McKenstry. You can catch me on the Chop Shop Tuesdays and Thursdays at 6 p.m. I'm excited about this Thursday show. And then this coming Tuesday, we're going to have a candid conversation, one-on-one, with Miss Sheila Dixon. That's right. We got her coming on in one of her first times being able to talk to the people in the city of Baltimore, where almost 50,000 people voted for her. She's going to come on and sit down with me. I don't know why I'm so favored of God to have all of these great guests, but that's a conversation you're not going to want to miss. Thank you again, LBS, for letting us broadcast from your page tonight. I'm always excited about the work that you guys are doing. Shock, it's only one thing left to say, man. KS, take me home.
I can be more. There's nothing that I can't achieve if I just believe. You can be more. You can make every dream.
All right, about to hop off. Y'all take it easy.
Thank you, brothers.
Have a good one. Peace.
Be more.
Yeah. I wake up every day and try to be more. I pray I be more. It's easy to achieve anything you believe. Like hold your head high. Girl, you got a reason to breathe. I see it rare mine. Boy, you got a reason to dream. Let's take flight. Give the children a reason to see redemption. We grow up in the jacks where it's evil and wicked. Where the people with success don't want to send you a visit. But we still finna make this life worth living. Now throw your hands to the sky if you feel it. Hey, throw your hands to the sky if you the realest. You got a vision, let's put them pistols away and make sure the OGs keep the community safe. In the world where the ladies crying, the babies dying, I think we can create that space to make a way for the ladies to ride and make baby giants. Be more, believe, let's play. I'm so in love with life.
There's nothing that I can't achieve.